densely. Atlanta was settled and built out very recently compared to most major U.S. and world cities. Approximately 70% of Pittsburgh's tree canopy, for instance, is made up of non-native species. And a recent book by Jill Johns says that 30% of Philadelphia's tree canopy is ailanthus, which all y'all know is a very kind of rough invasive. But Atlanta still retains pockets of its original forest, sometimes even in our own backyards. I kind of went on Google Earth and I had the same scale for all these different cities. So you can do this for yourself and compare. So where that's the scale, that little 2-mile mark there. These are some of our major cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, DC, Houston, and Atlanta. It really is different. And so why is it different? Oh, actually, sorry, I had a clue. This is Seoul, Korea. Give us a little perspective. That's actually the interior part of DC, and I even included the park. I even included part of Rock Creek Park in there. But the density of these cities is very, very different. This is the east side of Atlanta, looking very different from our other cities. This is Atlanta's west side. And just so that you know, there's only one tiny corner of this whole area that is protected as a park. All of the rest of this is just regular neighborhood. So Atlanta is really very, very different. So why do we still have so much nature? The metropolitan area of Atlanta was an old-growth forest in 1821. That's less than 20 decades ago, and ecologically speaking, that is a very short period of time. So in 1821, how did we get here? This is a map of all of the treaties, the cessions that the Native Americans made, giving land over to the state of Georgia and the United States government. And you can see in 1821, we're pretty late in the game. So the area, the Treaty of Indian Springs was the area between the Almoli, the Flint, the Chattahoochee, and then all the way down to that tip in South Georgia. So Atlanta, after the treaty was signed and the land was divided up, most of the properties went into lotteries. So farms were starting to be established in this area in about the 1820s and the 1840s. Now, like Charleston, Savannah, Philadelphia, and New York were founded 200 years before that. So if we think about that in perspective, the amount of time that's taken Atlanta to go from old-growth forest Indian territory to today is the same amount of time from the founding of our earliest cities to when Atlanta was handed over to the American government. That's a really big difference, and that's one of the reasons why we have so much nature left in our area. Some other things, even after our landscape was kind of divided up into farms, unlike other major cities, the land remained mostly in farms through the 1960s building boom, because we didn't really develop as a city until after air conditioning and after roadways, right? So that's very unusual for American cities. And then once we had older neighborhoods established, a lot of our older neighborhoods established in the 1890s and so forth, and our older trees were in those neighborhoods, they weren't cut because they weren't being used for commercial purpose. So ironically, sometimes in the inner city, we have older trees that didn't survive the extensive logging of the southeast that took place from the 1870s through the 1920s. So by accident of history, places that were not intensively farmed or developed still hold the surviving remnants of that original forest. And where are we likely to find these places? These slides are all from, I've been out in green spaces all over the metro area, so I've kind of noticed all of these things, and there's a little formula that seems to be accurate in how do we find these places. Steep slopes is almost the single best indicator. These areas were not farmed, and they weren't considered buildable until very recently. Stream corridors, especially with narrow floodplains. The broader floodplains along stream corridors were farmed, but the narrow floodplains weren't. It wasn't worth it for people to go in those slopes and deal with them. So these are some of the places we're likely to find the old-growth forest. This is an old-growth tree of, I believe it's American elm, and that is along the creek bank in the low water conservation garden. Rocky places were considered unsuitable for farming. A great amount of the western side of Atlanta is part of the Ben Hill batholith, right? And there's rock outcroppings everywhere. So there's a lot of great green spaces on Atlanta's west side that were timbered, but they weren't farmed because of the rocks. There's also memorial sites. This is a site actually in Kirkwood was originally a memorial site. It was actually platted as a park by DeKalb County in about 1915 or something like that. And that was set aside. It wasn't built on. They actually applied to have a Civil War memorial site on the property because the original house was a hospital, and they think some of the patients they weren't actually in a war, but they died of disease and so forth. And there may in fact also be some slave graves on that site. So this was a site, there were 200-year-old trees in there. Unfortunately, it's kind of a sad story. This is now no longer. There's 11 houses on that site. So some of our historic sites that we kind of forget about do have really high-quality forest on them. So this is a state champion white ash. Another example of a historic site. This is along the Beltline in Tanyard Creek. And the reason it's here is because this property, there's a steep slope that has a tremendous amount of biodiversity on it that goes into a floodplain, but it wasn't built, it wasn't developed because it was a site of a Civil War battle. So the reason this is left is because they were originally going to turn this into a memorial, but then when Kennesaw Mountain came online, they kind of ignored this property. But another reason why we have, probably the reason this tree is still here, is because it is associated with a property that was originally intended to be a memorial. So in our older neighborhoods, lots weren't graded. Back, in the day, before probably the 1980s or maybe the 70s, most of the houses were built on foundations to the grade of the landscape, and Atlanta has a lot of hills and so forth. So in the older neighborhoods, this is Kirkwood, we have very old trees. That tree I'm going to just kind of throw out a guess. Minimum 125, probably about 170 or 180, just in people's yards, because the older houses were built to grade. So this is actually in my neighborhood in Eastlake. Someone took down a tree. They kind of didn't have to. It's a long story. Won't go into it. But in any case, it's a couple doors down from me. They cut down a 180-year-old white oak. And I know this because I counted the rings. If you look at how tight the rings are on there, that tree was not very big. It was like 2 feet in diameter, about 11 feet up, and it was 180 years old. So it's old growth right in our neighborhoods. So our original old growth indicators, when we walk on a landscape, how can we tell we're looking at these remnants of our original forest? Well, if we find old growth trees that sprouted between the 1820s and the 1820s or 40s or before, they go back to the original forest, because our cutoff for this region is, 1820, 21, 25 realistically, because that's when people start cutting the timber. Forests with uneven aged trees, that's a sign of old growth. Mature second growth, forest-grown trees that have long, tall stems that were grown in a forest environment. Unusually high diversity of tree species, native plant communities, and indicator plants. So, of course, when we find large, old trees, I meant to talk about that. No, I'm not missing that one. Oh, sorry. Large, older trees, which sprouted in the early to mid-1800s or before, obviously we're looking at our original forest. That's actually also Lower Conservation Garden, which is a small strip, but it's old growth forest. Oh yeah, I think I got these a little backwards, sorry. Anyway, ignore that, we talked about that, but this tree right here, if you've ever been in there, that's in Fraser Forest, which is a remnant forest, which is a part of the Fernbank Forest. That's a tulip poplar, it's a twin tulip poplar, which would be very easily at home in Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest in North Carolina. If you walk up and get close to that tree, it's a different era, it's a different guy. It's worth walking down the creek to take a look at it. So when we have mature forest-grown trees, these are trees that grew up in a forest environment, so we know the forest was intact when they were growing. And so how can we tell them? They have long, particularly, certain species, oaks in particular, if they have a long trunk, tall trunk that don't have a lot of lateral branches, till you get to the very top, you know that it's grown in a forested environment. And you can kind of check that on historic aerial maps. When we see these kind of trees, you look on the historic aerials in the 1930s and 1950s, those are intact areas of forest. So that's a good clue. Here's another, this is on a tract called the Cumberlander, which is just a little bit off Lyndhurst, on the west side of Atlanta. But again, long, tall trunk, and the branches are kind of coming out way up there in the canopy. Forest with uneven aged trees, that's another way of telling. Trees with large multiple stems. When we walk through a forest and we see lots of these stems, we kind of think, oh, this forest isn't really that old. And then sometimes you look at the bases, and we see that these stems are coming out of stumps. So what it means is that this is the same tree that's putting up new stems that was maybe cut in the 1930s or the 1870s or even the 1820s. So that's a multiple stem basswood. This is looking up into a sycamore. This is the base of that sycamore. All those stems are the same tree. And that's in another forgotten about corner. That's up at Brookhaven. And the plant communities on that property are amazing. It's a remnant of the original forest. This is on the Pullman Forest, which is over in the Kirkwood area. And this is a cottonwood that has 4 stems. And if you look at the base of that tree, the stems are connected around the base. The base of that is something like 6 or 7 feet across. So you can imagine the tree that was cut. And then this is just a kind of a second growth. But what it means is that we have intact ground when we have that. Here's an umbrella magnolia in Brookwood Hills. When's the last time you saw an umbrella magnolia that was 18 inches in diameter, right? That guy is standing, there's like a circle. All those stems are coming up in a circle. If that was a tree that was intact and it wasn't in small pieces, it would be a champion tree because its roots are going back to the early 1800s, if not before. Another type of tree is damaged trees that weren't timbered for one reason or another. Y'all may know Bruce Morton, who a lot of the work that he did resulted in and along with West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, resulted in the acquisition of about 400 acres of green space. Correct me if I'm right, in Atlanta. So we give a shout out to Bruce, and this is his family. But it was perfect because we needed some scale for the size of this tree, which is in Hampton Beecher. So if you look at that, it's a huge tulip poplar. It's all damaged. Probably has fire scars in it. But let's look around to the other side. This is looking up the other side of the same tree. So what happened was, back in maybe the 1920s, when they timbered the rest of that property, they left that tree. So ironically now, it's much older than the surrounding forest. But it's on a steep slope, another one of our clues, and there are native plants in the bank next to it because we know when the roots have been there for that long of time, the soil hasn't been disturbed, and we know that our original forest is still intact. Bark that is very older bark on trees is another sign that we might have some old growth. This is a sourwood, again, is really damaged on the other side. You can see it's put up new shoots, but I would suspect this is an older tree, even though it doesn't look very spectacular. This is in Cascade Springs. There are other trees that are very old that were actually left so that maybe there was a pasture and it was cleared around them, and then the forest grew back up around them. So that's another type of older tree, but it's a little bit different. Rather than being forest grown, these were maybe grown, maybe got a start in the forest, but then spent a good bit of their lives growing in an open area. This is in Connolly Park. Those very old oaks that are estimated to be probably 250 or 300 years old were left originally, and maybe there was pasture or there was clearing around them. They grew a great deal, and now the forest is growing back up around them. And one of the things about that, here's another, this is also over in Kirkwood. This is on a private property on a steep bank. The tree to the left is now the largest tree in the city of Atlanta, 66 inches DBH. You guys know trees? That's huge. That's huge. They just don't make them like that anymore. Just left over in a little bank, forgotten corner. Atlanta has this stuff. Here's over in Briar Lake Forest. You can see that, there's a pointer thing, isn't there? Yes. Mm-hmm. So anyway, if you see this tree back here, this is a big old white oak back in the back, and you can see how its branches kind of started maybe coming out horizontally and then grew up. And we also see some nodes that are left over from branches that the tree on purpose kind of shut off, because when the forest came back up, it's not getting any more light in its lower branches. So sometimes when you walk in the woods and you see these big old trees that have kind of, quote, dying branches closer to the ground, that's on purpose. The tree is done with them. It's not getting enough light. So it's not an unhealthy tree. It's just an illustration of how the tree is adapting to the changing forest. Mature beech trees are another indicator of our original forest because they wait. If you do a clear cut, beech trees don't just pop right up. They wait till there's about 80 years of growth in the canopy before they start coming up. So if you're looking at an 80-year-old beech, you're looking at a 160-year-old forest. Also, interestingly, in some of the green spaces, we find a lot of white oak, beech, and hickory trees because they were mast trees. And so early settlers knew the value of that. You guys may be familiar, but there weren't any stock laws until the late 19th century. In the 1890s, we had to have fences for livestock. Before, people just branded their cows or their pigs or whatever, and they ran loose in the forest, and they were eating the acorns and the beech nuts of these older forests. And everyone, that was a very valuable asset to have forests full of beech and hickory and oak. So sometimes these older trees we find in our green spaces were left by the early settlers that knew the value of those trees. And I just, on a hunch, I actually called the Beech Nut Gum Company to just kind of see what their origin was. There's a museum for beech nut, because we think of that as gum. Beech Nut started as a company that sold pork products. So they were using beech nuts, like they had a beech nut rub and a hickory nut rub and so forth. But you know, back in the day, in the 1800s, people knew the value of these trees, and so that's why we still find some of them. This is also in Briar Lake, huge beech tree here, very large beech tree, large white oaks. These were all left on the original properties. Another indicator that we're starting to get a little bit older forest is we start to see moss accumulating on the north faces of trees. And this is actually in Fraser Forest. If you guys remember, you know, from your history lessons, when Harriet Tubman, you know, was leading enslaved peoples out of the South and up to freedom in the North and so forth, but, you know, it's kind of a, you know, a cliche to say it, but we would feel the north faces of the trees, right, for the moss. You could tell which way you were going if you were having to travel on a moonless night or something. And so let's think about that for a second. Huge amounts of moss. It takes hundreds of years for moss to accumulate on the north sides of trees. So when people were escaping slavery, they were going into an old-growth forest, because that forest was an old-growth forest before 1860. The southeast was cut in the 1870s through the 1930s. So that original old-growth forest was a very different forest back in the day. High diversity of tree species in small areas, that's another way we can know that we have high-value forest, I should say. This is a fairly common tree, but it's not common if you're not in a forest remnant. American hornbeam, umbrella magnolia, don't see that unless you're in a nice forest remnant. Alternately, dogwood, same thing. We see a lot of native redbud, not the invasive redbud, the native original mulberry in a lot of our stream bottoms when we're finding original forest remnants. Buckeye is a great indicator. And then hazelnut. There's a bunch of hazelnut over in, when's the last time you saw, like, 30 hazelnut trees in a forest? That's over at Johnson Taylor. And then here are some of the species that are found together. This is not the only list, but these are, you start to see one property that has a bunch of these guys on it, we know we're looking at a forest. These are common things just around the metro area. This is in the city of Atlanta. Andrew knows this one. Yep. So anyway, and why did you look at the rocks, right? Probably wasn't farmed because there were a lot of rock outcrops in this area. But this kind of the smoking gun of knowing if we have original forest is the native plant communities. Because the native plant communities have been there, even if the trees were taken, they're still hanging in there. Bloodroot is a good indicator. Wild geranium, This is a plant that doesn't often flower. It's not very showy. People don't recognize it too much. It's called lion's foot or white lettuce. It's a Prananthes, or I think it changed its name to Nablus. But when you see this plant in the forest floor, you start looking around, you're going to find trillium, you're going to find bloodroot, you're going to find the other kind of more charismatic wildflowers. This is in Cascade Springs. I've only seen this in original forest remnants. It's a wood sorrel. This is sweet Cicely. There's a ton of sweet Cicely on a couple of properties I've seen. Possibly it was used for medicinal, very common medicinal for Native Americans, so it may even have been cultivated in some of those places. Doll's Eyes, which is an Actaea, that and Black Cohosh, which is closely related. That's never going to come up in anybody's yard. When you start to see those, you know you're in original remnants. That's actually Beecher Hills. The wild ginger is another indicator. It's a little more common and tends to be one of those that holds on the longest. But when we see that one, that's another indicator species. Spotted wintergreen, another indicator. And we start to find these, when we have older trees, that's an older tulip poplar, you can't really see it, this is what it really looks like when you're out there. You're not taking a really pretty picture, you're just walking around, it's harder to identify. This is Jack in the Pulpit. But when we have older trees, and the roots have been in the soil for 150 or 200 years, the soil hasn't been disturbed, so that's when we know our plant communities are still intact. There's a little bloodroot in an older forest there. That's in Beecher Hills. Here's another example of old, really old tree roots here. This is a disturbed area, but it has original forest. And right here, the next slide is like this little pocket, like right there next to one of those roots. That's a rarer form of the wild ginger, the Hexastylus shuttle over the eye, which is a lot less common than the Hexastylus erifolia. And this is again the champion white ash, and because its roots have been in the ground a long time, we still have a seed bed. These trilliums are coming up right in its critical root base. So these are some of the plants. Again, when we start seeing maybe 3 or 4 of these guys all together on a property, that's also an original forest remnant. Okay, so other kind of cool stuff. Everybody good?
Yeah.
Okay, still going. It's dense. It's really dense. Okay. So anyway, I don't know if you guys are aware, but we have a lot of native orchids, right? And they need original forest soils. This is our cranefly orchid. Every orchid has a partner, at least one partner fungi. It can't germinate without that fungi. So orchid seeds they're spores really, and they're very, very tiny, and they land on everything. But they can only germinate and grow in these original rich older soils. And then there's another kind of seed. These are what we call our indicator species. Wild gingers, hepatica, bloodroot, and trilliums. These plants have a seed that has a little fatty attachment on it that's called an elizome. It's kind of like a little handle for ants. So the ants come and they grab onto this elizome and they feed it to their young because it's really rich in fats, and then they deposit that seed in their refuse piles. And so that's a really rich place for it to germinate. So, some plants, seeds are spread by the wind, or there's a little burr, it gets stuck on your pant leg or your dog, all right? But these seeds are not going very far. So if you see a bank of trillium, right, it's been there for hundreds of years, even if the trees above it have been cut. Some of these plants have seed beds. Some of our forests have seed beds that can last 100 years. And it's because we're in a deciduous forest. So in the deciduous forest, those little small plants, those spring ephemerals that we love, they have to take advantage of that moment of sunlight between basically March and late April. They put up their leaf, they put up their flower and their seed all in that little moment of sunlight. And then they kind of go dormant the rest of the year. So everything in a deciduous forest is on this very long, slow timetable. Like some of these trilliums, not this species, there's another species of trillium, the actual individual plant itself can live for like 70 years. So these are a very slow timetable for us. This is another very rich forest. There's a ton of interesting wildflowers. This is part of the original forest, unusual for a hilltop. If you look at the trees, they're not really big old trees. So we know that this was probably timbered. It might never have been completely clear cut, but it's been intermittently timbered. But that doesn't mean the forest has been destroyed. The forest is still there and it's able to regenerate itself. Cutting trees is not the worst thing. I'm saying this, you hear this? Right? Cutting trees is not the worst thing for the forest. It's destroying the soil. So this is not going to grow back in native forest. Maybe not ever, right? It's done. Those forest soils in the Appalachian environment that we have, they've been building for millions of years. And you know, take them out, you're not going to get them back. So new building practices, what's happening in our environment in Atlanta is people used to build to build to the landscape and build a foundation, but now we're doing a lot more grading. When we do this grading, we're taking out a lot more of those original soils. This apparently, I didn't know this property, this slide was actually given to me by somebody else. That apparently had been an old growth forest area in Tucker, and if you look, you can even look at the soil. Look at the darker soil up here compared to where it was. So that was an older forest at one time. This is over in City of Decatur. When we start doing these kind of massive gradings for these houses, you know, that soil isn't going to bring our forest back. Just some things about, kind of think of a little phrase, it takes a forest to raise a tree. Healthy soils are ancient systems with extraordinarily complex relationships, most of which we actually don't even understand. If you guys are familiar with, who's the ant guy, the famous ecologist?
Wilson? E.O. Wilson.
E.O. Wilson, thank you. E.O. Wilson says that soils are the next frontier, and we're going to learn so much when we start to look at our soils. One of the things we're starting to realize is that trees, this is only research that's been really established in the last 10 years. Trees, particularly, and perhaps all species of plants, have extraordinarily complex relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. In fact, data from NASA satellites can actually look at trees from a satellite and be able to know which species of fungi these trees are growing in association with. And when they know that, that's one of the things that they're using to try and establish how we can figure if these forests are going to adapt to global warming, for instance. Scientists also call this mycorrhizal, if you're not familiar with mycorrhizal fungi, what it is tons of fungi, they put up mushrooms and all of that, but they mostly are these very large living organisms that grow in association with tree and plant roots. So their mycorrhiza, those little filaments, grow into tree roots, and they connect trees. So there's these networks of trees. Scientists are starting to call it the wood wide web. There's a lot of research that's been done by Suzanne Samard, you may have heard, out in the Pacific Northwest. So in any case, trees are getting all kinds of nutrients that they wouldn't normally be able to get from these mycorrhizal fungi networks. They're able to communicate with each other about pathogens. It's a whole nother talk. I won't go there. But in any case, this is all part of these older soils and why these older forest remnants are important. We already said that grading is more damaging there, and trees that are planted in poor soils can't really replace the ecosystem services. Part of the reason is because they're not as healthy. Y'all probably remember the American elms that were wiped out, by the Dutch elm disease because they were planted in the Midwest and the northern states. Well, one of the reasons those all died out was because they were out of their ecosystem and they were in street plantings. They didn't have their mycorrhizal fungi with them. There were already trees that were under stress. So when Dutch elm disease, they came and wiped them out. If y'all walk in green space, just about any green space with a nice stream corridor in the city of Atlanta, you will find plenty of American elm. I have 3 coming up as volunteers in my yard. So probably part of the reason we lost those American elms because they weren't growing in the forest environment where they were intended to be. This is, if you're all familiar with this is a way that arborists and others measure soil horizon. Usually in the city of Atlanta, if you poke that in the ground, you get topsoil about like this, and then the rest of it's red clay. Well, this happens to be in my neighborhood. That's right in the critical root zone of this tree. So you know, now that, you know, sometimes people, you know, use grading and so forth. This tree is probably, in my neighborhood, I'm gonna guess it's 170. The other trees that were cut down that were that size, this is actually bigger than them, so I guess 170 to 190. And it survived. Houses were built around it. You know, this is on 2 lots. Someone has a house here, someone has a garage here. That soil sample, the one right behind here, was taken, like right here, right behind these people's garage. That's where that soil sample was taken. That's the old growth soil. It's right there in our neighborhoods. So old growth forests and original forests have the ability to regenerate themselves. What about invasives, right? We all know invasives are a problem. So, you know, we can't let invasives get too out of hand. This is also in West Atlanta, a little bit of ivy and wisteria that's gotten pretty out of hand there. But we also need to make sure that we don't damage our original forest when we have invasives that are in older and original forest things, locations. I left this here, you know, to show the scale. But, you know, you just look at that and you go, oh, man, that's trashed out. There's nothing there. And then you look a little closer, and there's trillium, which means that we've got original soils. So when we do invasive removal in this particular kind of site, we want to do that very carefully.
Now, for those of us who may not think that looks trashed out, why do you say that it looks trashed out?
Because it's all, because why?
The monkey grass.
Yeah.
Monkey grass.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Very invasive. I've let it get away from me in my own yard. I've been fighting it ever since. And what it does is it grows over, and then the other species can't survive.